Most state boundaries are a combination of natural and artificial. So if someone would walk from Iowa into Minnesota, they can't look down at the ground and say, I see 4330 on the ground. Some surveyor went out and determined this is where 4330 is. I'm Dr. William E. Lass, a historian and author. The last book I wrote is titled Shaping the North Star State, A History of Minnesota's Boundaries. There is a widespread urban myth in Minnesota that the northwest angle resulted from the surveyors there. Well, not only is this wrong, but it's a lazy way of looking at history. You look at it casually and say, I don't understand it, and therefore somebody made a mistake. Well, your obligation is to understand it. It's not to shrug it off. Minnesota's northern boundary resulted by treaties between the United States and Great Britain. That part of Minnesota that's on the Canadian side of Lake of the Woods is always called the Northwest Angle. So at the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States and Great Britain, by a Treaty of Paris, agreed to boundaries for the new country. They relied on a map that was almost 30 years old. There seemed to be a natural boundary on the north formed by the Great Lakes, and Lake of the Woods appeared on the map as a source of the Great Lakes. So you follow what was supposed to be the Great Lakes watershed as far as the northwest point of Lake of the Woods. The gap was not closed finally until 1818, when the United States and Great Britain agreed to use the 49th parallel from Lake of the Woods to the Continental Divide in the Rocky Mountains. So in that same treaty, they specified that we will agree to draw a due north-south line until it intersects the 49th parallel. If you go from the northwest point of Lake of the Woods to the 49th parallel, you do leave this odd little chimney on the Canadian side of Lake of the Woods. Iowa started seriously agitating for statehood in 1844. Generally speaking, what they wanted was a Mississippi River boundary as far north as possible. And so when Iowa held its first constitutional convention, there were proposals to run the boundary from the mouth of the Big Sioux northeastward to what is present-day Sauk Rapids, Minnesota. So in other words, under that proposal, anything to the east and south of that line, which would have included the Twin Cities, that all would have been part of Iowa. And what emerged in Iowa was the thinking that the most important thing to Iowans was to have access to two great navigable rivers, the Mississippi on the east and the Missouri on the west. And the Congress of the United States countered and said, all right, if we accept the western boundary as the Missouri River, then you have to agree to put some sort of limitation on the north, which is where 4330 comes from. Wisconsin was admitted to statehood in 1848. At the time, it applied for statehood in December of 1846. The suggested boundaries were exactly where they're at today. The voters of Wisconsin had to vote on the Constitution, and they rejected the Constitution, not because of the boundary, but because the Constitution had such provisions as women could inherit property, which to conservatives was too liberal, so they rejected it. The Second Convention was dominated by Wisconsin expansionists. So in the Second Constitutional Convention of 1848, these expansionists said, look, among other things, we want the Falls of St. Anthony. So their proposal for a boundary was that Wisconsin's northwestern boundary start at the mouth of the Rum River. This is present-day Anoka. And then shoot a line from Anoka to the St. Louis River. Minnesotans, to say the least, had a conniption fit. So, among other things, they organized a petition drive. The Congress of the United States said the best thing to do is to limit Wisconsin to the original proposal. Let's go back to what was proposed in 1846. So after thousands of words and much debate, you come full circle and you're back to the boundaries as they exist today. When the House of Representatives was considering Minnesota's boundaries, the House Committee on Territories made a change so that the boundary didn't follow the Big Sioux. It followed from the southern end of Big Stone to Iowa, in other words, where it is at today. The change in Congress was made in a committee. There is no written explanation of it. Lobbyists, of course, tend not to leave very visible tracks. This is why they're lobbyists. So these people recognize that Minnesota has a capital, Minnesota has a penitentiary, Minnesota has a university. So if you look to the west of Minnesota, you want to restrict Minnesota in some way. And if you restrict the boundary, then this opens up the potential for establishing a future important city, say at the falls of the Big Sioux River. Now, who today would care to argue that they were wrong? People historically are very deficient about explaining why they do things. They'll leave a record of what they do. They're not near as good about leaving records of why they do it. In a way, it would barely brush the surface. My book is documented. Serious students of history can go to the footnotes and they can go back to the original sources. They should do this routinely. I've done it myself, and I think it would be quite instructive for individuals to do that.